This is LBC, leading Britain's conversation with Olly Mann. Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Olly Mann on LBC.
Good evening there, this is LBC and I'm Olly Mann, sitting in for Ian Collins one final time till he's back from his holidays next week. I'm here until 10 p.m. Nick Abbott, of course, will be along at 10 for your late night show. But as it is Saturday and it is 9 p.m, it is time for the news panel, our weekly round table, looking forward to the big stories that we think will make the news this week on LBC. Tonight I'll be joined by the director of the Migration Matters Trust and editor of Labour Uncut, that's Atul Hatwal, and the prospective parliamentary candidate for UKIP in Dartford and Kent, that's Elizabeth Jones. Phone lines are down for this hour, but we want to take your texts and tweets as you respond to what the panellists say. Text me 84850 or tweet me at LBC throughout the hour here on LBC. So, firstly, welcome Atul. Hello, good evening, welcome along.
Good evening, Olly.
Hi. Labour Uncut, editing that website when we've got the debates being debated, if you see what I mean, at the moment. And today, Chris Patten telling the BBC he thought David Cameron's strategy is he should be more scared of Ed Miliband than Nigel Farage. Do you think he's right? Do you think Ed Miliband has a secret weapon hidden somewhere, some charisma that people are going to suddenly discover closer to the election?
Well, I guess when it comes to the debates and when it comes to the nitty-gritty of the election as people engage with their electoral choice, maybe things can change. But at Uncut, we've been broadly sceptical. We have sort of questions about some of Labour's strategy. We are from a centrist tradition in the party, and we are passionate about wanting a Labour victory. But when you're so far behind on the economy and we trail on leadership by such a margin as well, it's very rare. In fact, never before has an opposition come from this position to win. So we're hopeful, we live in hope, you fight to win, but ...
Yes, OK. So for you, Ed Miliband perhaps famously not mentioning the deficit in his speech at the conference, that's kind of his biggest error of the year, you know?
It's in politics, there's often a sort of... people fixate on individual events and issues, and actually it's the broad strategy. What Labour's now saying on the deficit, we should have said 3 years ago, and persuaded people that we are serious, because we are, and our policies are very serious, about tackling public spending, about balancing the books, but doing it in a way that's so that the public services aren't hit, and actually that's actually balanced so we have growth. But we hadn't really said that for the last 3 years. We've given the impression that we were going to oppose all the cuts, and that's really not productive. And that's why, unfortunately, we are 10 to 20 points behind, take your pick from the pollsters, on the economy. And that's a really big mountain to climb before May. OK, Atul, thank you. Also joining me this evening, Elizabeth Jones. Good evening to you.
Good evening to you, Olly.
Now, you are a prospective parliamentary candidate for UKIP.
Yes.
Congratulations, first of all, on
Thank you
being
very
selected for Dartford and Kent. I mean, what do you make of what Chris Patten was saying as well? I might as well put the same question to you. He said Nigel Farage is probably a balloon which is deflating.
Well, I really hope that he sticks to that strategy and does not focus on Farage and UKIP and focuses on dear little Ed Miliband, so that we can then build up and really carpet bomb Cameron.
I mean, when people are talking about the debates,
yes,
and we'll talk a little bit about the Green Party later because they're making an announcement this week. But looking at the week just gone, when people are talking about the debates, do you agree that David Cameron, probably you both agree on this, that David Cameron wants the Greens involved because he's frightened of Nigel Farage being there?
Of course, it's patently obvious. He certainly doesn't want to engage with Nigel Farage on any level. They're simply incomparable. We have Cameron, who is a fop, basically. I don't think he's ever really had to work for a living.
Oh, come on, he's been Prime Minister for the last 5 years. That's a hard job.
Well, he has a multitude of advisors propping him up. He has a multitude of backers financing him. He doesn't really have to put any significant creative energy or I wish to imagine much of himself into that, whereas Farage is a very, very different animal. Farage is a self-created politician. He stands on his own two
The thing is,
feet.
obviously, I mean, where he'd suffer, I guess, is in the areas of Europe and immigration where clearly UKIP want to put pressure on. But the issue, Atul, I suppose, is just as equally bothersome for Ed Miliband. Obviously, the Greens are taking more Labour votes than UKIP, but UKIP are taking some.
Yes, UKIP sort of certainly are a threat on the flank in certain parts of Labour's heartland communities. But to be honest, I think when it comes to the debates, David Cameron, regardless, doesn't want to do the debates because he doesn't want to give an opportunity, both to Farage but also actually to Ed Miliband, to demonstrate to voters, to challenge voters, demonstrate to voters that maybe their initial conception is wrong, and to give a chance to reset the clock. And I think there is one note of caution I'd raise for Labour's strategy here, which is, and the Labour strategy is that the broadcasters should empty chair Cameron. And I think that's very tough, because the experience of the last set of debates in 2010 was that the unknown quantity, the person who is seen as the outsider, finds it very easy, and in that case it was Nick Clegg, to just poke fun at the main parties and to come up with some, frankly, pretty glib statements and glib propositions which don't get tested to the same level of scrutiny as the main parties. So if you had a situation where you had Miliband, Clegg, Farage and you could have Natalie Benn, but if it was just Miliband, Clegg and Farage, then actually both Clegg and Miliband would suffer, not because of any sort of issues necessarily with the policies, but just the presentation of it. The new face, the fresh voice, always carries a premium. Clegg was that in 2010. If we have the debates with all of the leaders, including Natalie Benn, Ben and Farage will be that this time round.
And actually, I must ask you, Elizabeth, regarding the pub Landlord standing in South Thanet, where Nigel Farage obviously is intending to win, really, isn't he? Al Murray now standing for the Free United Kingdom Party, FUKP. You have to be careful how you say it at this time of the evening.
It's after the watershed.
He is clearly trying to mock and satirise not just UKIP as a party by taking the logo and turning it upside down and talking about getting out of, what was it, not just Europe but the solar system, but also he's specifically mocking Nigel Farage for his standing in a pub with a pint of beer presentational style. Farage sort of laughed it off and UKIP laughed it off this week, and I think they dealt with it very well, but it is going to be a problem, isn't it, if Al Murray is following him around at every event?
No, I don't think it'll be a problem at all. If Al Murray's following him around everywhere, he'll have all the press, all the TV cameras following him too. He'll get two for the price of one. You've got Erzatz Farage and you've got the real Farage. Everyone's going to vote for the real Farage. I think you get double the publicity. I think it's a very positive thing. One thing I really don't like about Al Murray, though, of course, he is a distant cousin of Cameron, and frankly, I find his portrayal of the pub landlord, albeit I appreciate it's very jolly, in some ways I do think he's somewhat making fun of working class people, which is slightly... it's a bit of a sting in that, which
How
like.
is he making fun of working class people?
Because he's not from that tradition. You know, he's a distant cousin of David Cameron. I understand he's privately educated, and for him to assume that persona, but I think it is... I've never really liked the humour,
but specifically, is there an example of how do you think he's making fun of working class people?
It's the whole persona, the sort of rough and ready, I'm the pub landlord type of geezer. But they're doing the geezer kind of act, where, you know, it's... I think that he's taking something which I don't personally feel very comfortable with.
Well, this sort of seems to me to hint at Emily Thornberry's tweet, doesn't it, in Rochester?
Exactly,
it was that
you've hit the nail on the head, Olly.
It was the England flag thing and the feeling that if you're in an area where people support UKIP, you're in an area where you might have people that are getting all of their political information from The Sun and go on holidays to Butlins, and they're perhaps poor and ill-informed. But I think Al Murray's saying something cleverer than that, though, isn't he? He's actually making a comment about the way politics is conducted at the moment by actually taking the mickey out of an entire presentational style.
Well, he's not really taking a mickey out of Farage, because that has been his presentational style from... I mean, how long has he been on the comedy circuit now? 20, 30 years? That's been his style from day one. But yes, I think that's an outstanding analogy, Olly, I really do. He is perhaps the Emily Thornberry of comedy. Thank you.
I mean, do you think he's going to have some success, Atul, in mocking Nigel Farage and basically making the point, I'm a joke, I'm a comedian, so is he?
Potentially, yes. I recall in the 1980s the incredible damage Spitting Image did to David Steele, and indeed David Owen. Satire and comedy is a very, very sharp weapon. It can't be wielded by politicians, but the careful barb, the witty joke, and especially in an age of Twitter where 140 well-placed characters get retweeted multiple times, he has the potential in Thanet to reset the agenda in terms of what the media is reporting and what people are seeing. And the damage that was done to David Steele and David Owen was to caricature them and make them seem irrelevant and actually not just faintly but largely ridiculous. That is actually the threat that Al Murray brings for Nigel Farage. And frankly, if he's not funny, it won't work. But satire is a very, very tricky thing. And if he manages it, and he has had a very successful career, and he is very funny. If he manages it, then I think there will be damage, and it won't be necessarily in terms of the votes he attracts. It'll be in terms of Nigel Farage's broader persona. And my sort of observation of Nigel Farage is, when under pressure, he doesn't really take a joke terribly well.
Elizabeth?
Well, only time will tell. I have to say that the Spitting Image was an iconoclastic TV show. We'll never see the like ever again, and since certain unfortunate events have happened over the last few years, I don't think we ever will again. And but no, I don't agree with that. I think that Al Murray's humour is not sufficiently sharp for that to have much impact or even dent the Farage tank.
Well, I think that the truth is it's appealing to a kind of Guardian reading, tweeting public, which isn't necessarily...
Well, they're never going to vote UKIP
They're not
anyway,
UKIP's voters anyway,
exactly.
are they? So is it preaching to the converted? I don't know, but I think it will have some limited damage, I think, and it's very interesting. Anyway, I'm deviating completely off script. Thank you for going along with me. When we return, we will start talking about the stories which we predict are going to be the big stories of the week here on LBC. I am joined this evening by Atul, Hatwal and Elizabeth Jones. I'm Olly Mann. This is LBC. The time now, 9:15.
Olly Mann on LBC.
Good evening there, this is LBC with me, Olly Mann, sitting in for Ian Collins until 10 p.m. tonight. Until then, we're doing the news panel, our weekly roundtable, looking forward to the big stories that are going to make the news this week on LBC. I'm joined tonight by the editor of Labour Uncut, Atul Hatwal, and a prospective parliamentary candidate for UKIP, Elizabeth Jones. We've already had a bit of a chat and a catch-up, so let's get straight into the stories now. And this is what's going to happen on Monday.
They're simply just taking it, going into their shells and feeling, oh my God, what have we done for events that are miles away, nothing to do with us, and yet we're being made to apologise for them constantly. We're being made to sort of answer for people we don't agree with, people we don't know.
Explaining how isolated many Muslims feel in Britain right now, that's Mohammed Khalil, the Met Police's advisor on Islamophobia. He's responding there to mosques across Britain, excuse me, saying they've received a torrent of Islamophobic abuse, including death threats after last week's terror in Paris. And on Monday, the Danish branch of the Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamisation of the West, Pegida, will stage a march against what they're calling extreme Islam in Copenhagen. And there's mounting concern by some European governments, including Germany, about the rise of Pegida following a number of mass rallies, one of which attracted 25,000 participants last week in Dresden. I suppose there are two questions here. One is, how do we react in the UK to this happening around the rest of Europe? And the other question is, do we worry that this might come to the UK, and what do we do when it does, or if it does? Atul, I'll start with you on both of those. What's your reaction to what is happening on Monday in Copenhagen, and do you feel concerned about the UK as well?
Well, I think Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, had it exactly right in her New Year message when she called on her countrymen not to follow this road, and she called it out exactly as it was, that the people organising these marches have prejudice in their hearts, and some have hate. And I'd say sort of 3 points about Pegida. One is a point of fact. They start in Germany. In Germany, 95% of the country is not Muslim. 95 out of every 100. The overwhelming majority are Christian, but there are thousands of people marching about just the 5%, and that seems to have been lost in the discussion too. The people who have organised this have certainly a dubious record. So Lutz Bachmann has been in jail for burglary offences and drugs offences, and his cohort Siegfried Dabritz is involved with football hooligans and biker gangs. So that gives you a sort of sense of the context. And the third thing is, if you focus on a small group as the source of prejudice, as I said, 5% of Germany is Muslim. If you focus on that one group as the source of prejudice, as the source of misogyny, then you give a pass to everyone else. Wherever you're from, whatever your creed, extremism, racism, misogyny, homophobia needs to be tackled. And that is where you just load it all onto one small group. That's a very worrying development, whether it be in Germany, in Copenhagen, or in this country.
But I mean, it seems to me that's worrying because of the implication of the march that, you know, all Muslims are in some way involved or complicit or could be complicit in extremity. But actually, on the face of it, to campaign against extreme Islamism of the type that leads to terrorism is a reasonable thing to do, isn't it? I mean, that's what happened in Paris.
It is a reasonable thing to campaign against extremism of any faith. If you are an extremist of the Christian faith, then where that leads is to the greatest act of terror that Europe has experienced, which was in Norway with Anders Breivik, when 77 people were massacred. That is an act of the far right and the far Christian right. There is no more special burden on Muslims to tackle extremism than there is on Christians, on Hindus, on Jews. It is a burden we all share, and more needs to be done in the Muslim community, but equally, just to focus on the Muslim community to the exclusion of everyone else, rather gives a pass to extremism in other areas.
Elizabeth Jones, how do you react to Pegida specifically and what they're up to in Denmark, and how would you feel if we saw something similar happening here?
Well, of course, UKIP is a party that is concerned about Britain and British interests and the safety of people who live here. So what really happens in Denmark is something that we would observe. We wouldn't necessarily express an opinion. It's not our job to do that. That is within the remit of the Danish government and the Danish people. But the question we have to ask is why such a big movement has sprung up so quickly. I mean, it's very sort of akin to the EDL. And I know that Lutz Bachmann's rationale was that he witnessed a big fight, apparently between Salafists attacking the PKK. The PKK had set up an anti-Islamic State rally, and apparently the Salafists were attacking the PKK. And then about a couple of days later, the PKK were having a rally. He was very concerned about arms being shipped to these various groups. And then next thing, 20th of October, he's setting up a massive march. Now, it's incredible that in that short period of time that he can gather such a huge following. He's even prepared a manifesto whereby he maintains and upholds the rights of asylum. He maintains and upholds the rights of what he calls moderate Muslims to remain in Germany, has no issue with that at all.
But is it incredible, or is it just that he's filling a vacuum? You know, people have an experience like we've seen in Paris. They naturally feel scared, and they look to someone who's saying, well, here's a group to blame.
Well, I don't know if it's a group to blame. I mean, one of the questions we have to ask is why the focus on extremist Islam. I mean, we have even Stephen Pollard, the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, tweeting that nearly every Jewish friend he has in France now is giving serious consideration to leaving France because they're so concerned about the constant low level of attacks on them. Not serious, and we're not talking about these grandiose, extravagant terrorist attacks with AK-47s, low-grade attacks, stained through windows, shouting at streets. So I think that perhaps there does need to be an examination as to why there seems to be such a perception that there's a spread and...
but there's an examination, isn't there, and then there's having a march.
Yeah.
And obviously, you know, we all defend the rights of people to have a march. Course. But if you're inciting racial hatred, we'd all agree that's not good.
Well, I don't think he's inciting racial hatred. I think his concern is about the spread of Islamicisation, which I think all of us here would oppose. No one wants to live in... certainly don't want to see continental Europe under the heel of, let's say, Islamic State. No one would want to see that. I'm sure we can all agree.
Number one, that is... what they've created is a straw man. 5% of Germany is Muslim, 95% is not. You know, 99% of the Muslims in Germany aren't aren't of extreme persuasion, as indeed the vast majority of all faiths are not extremist. But one thing I would note, when Pegida had their march in Dresden, there was immediately afterwards there was a knife attack on some migrants in Dresden. It sets a tone and creates a climate of fear. When you pick on a single minority and focus all of the ills of the world on them, then inevitably prejudice follows.
OK, let's take story number 2. This is something that's going to happen on Tuesday.
It proves the point that the Home Secretary has been listening to survivors and survivor organisations, and that's all we ever wanted, is for her to take on board our concerns.
That's Peter Saunders there from the National Association for People Abused in Childhood, responding last month to Theresa May moving to overhaul the Rotherham child sex abuse inquiry. What's happening this week is on Tuesday, a second session on the independent panel inquiry into child sexual abuse will be heard by the Home Affairs Committee, hearing from the author of the Rotherham Child Sexual Exploitation Report, Professor Alexis Jay. A new and full independent inquiry into the case is due to start later this year. Now, Elizabeth, this was important. This particular witness, I suppose, is important because the Jay report was the one that said 1,400 children had been subjected to exploitation in Rotherham, and that for a while all of that was being ignored.
Yes, well, UKIP has very unfortunate history with Rotherham. Before this story came out, I'm sure you're aware, in 2012, Joyce Thacker, the director of the Child Services in Rotherham, removed foster children from foster parents solely on the basis that they were UKIP members, stating that they had to be removed because they were not actively promoting multiculturalism. So, very strange setup in Rotherham. And also, another strange twist is that the UKIP MEP Jane Collins and UKIP councillor Cavan Vines are now being sued for slander and libel by 3 Labour MPs because of the situation arising from this report.
OK, but to take the politics out of it,
yes.
with regard to the report itself, what would you like to see happen? Because it is taking a long time, isn't it, to get going?
Well, it's taking I don't know why it's taking a long time. What I would like to see happen, well, I'd like to see all the victims getting proper and full financial compensation. I'd like to see all the perpetrators in prison and subject to very significant compensation orders. And if they have rental properties, for all those rental properties to be seized.
Atul, how do you react to this ongoing... I hesitate to use the word farce when it's something so serious, but, you know, it has been a process that keeps getting delayed and delayed, this child sexual abuse inquiry.
I think, broadly, it's a total disgrace. And, from start to finish, from the way victims' complaints and victims' pleas were ignored, to the way what seems from the outside, it has all of the hallmarks of a dreadful bureaucratic cover-up, to the way this process is dragged out and on and on and on. The time has come for these poor girls, and there's Pakistani girls in there, there's white English girls in there, for these poor girls to get some justice, and it is utterly, utterly appalling. And it's a sort of failing of the British state and British governance, when our wheels of bureaucracy sort of turn so slowly, and the first reaction is always to cover oneself, then to throw sand in the wheels of the machinery, and then sort of protest and object and to drag it all out. And actually, what I think in this situation requires more political focus, more of a spotlight on this from senior politicians, because that is what will get things moving.
OK, it seems like a good point to break. A very serious couple of stories we've been talking about, of course, but much more still to come as we look forward to the week of news stories we're expecting to make the news here on LBC. Tonight being joined by Atul Hatwal, who just heard there, and Elizabeth Jones before that. Keep your text coming in, 84850, to react to what you've heard so far. We've had some of them. I'll let you know what people have been saying after the news. You're with Olly Mann, sitting in for Ian Collins until 10. LBC News Time now. It's 9:30.
Olly Mann on LBC.
Yes, good evening. This is LBC with me, Olly Mann, sitting in for Ian Collins tonight until 10 p.m. Mr. Nick Abbott will be here. You'll have the pleasure of his company after 10 this evening until 1 in the morning. But until then, it is the news panel, as ever, our weekly roundtable looking forward to the big stories that will make the news this week on LBC. I'm joined tonight by the Director of Migration Matters Trust and the Editor of Labour Uncut, that's Atul Hatwal, and a prospective parliamentary candidate for UKIP, Elizabeth Jones, who's standing in Dartford and Kent. We don't take your calls this hour, but we do take your texts and tweets. 84850, the number to text, at LBC to tweet. Gary says, Olly, I like the lady you have on from UKIP. I live in Dartford. She's got my vote and my family's.
Well, thank you very much, Gary. I shall come round to see you.
Whereas, in a purely... pleasant way.
Purely professional manner, of course.
And Thomas has emailed Olly at lbc.co.uk. How can that woman criticise Al Murray for being privately educated? Look at Nigel Farage and the image he tries to portray. He is not the everyman. He is a privately educated banker turned career politician.
Well... He is the everyman in his approach and his sociability toward people. He's not standoffish. What you see is what you get. He is genuinely that person.
But Al Murray is an elitist comedian.
Exactly.
Just so long as we're on the same page there. Okay. Yes. And this is a text from Tony at LBC. Not sure how the bloke from Labour Uncut can get away with saying Christians are as radical as Muslims. Does he watch the news?
I wasn't saying in some areas Christians are there is Christian extremism. You just have to look at what happened in Norway with Anders Breivik. But my point is that extremism, wherever it is, needs to be faced down, whether it is in the Muslim community, the Jewish community, or the Hindu community, or the Christian community.
There we go. Keep them coming in. 84850 to text, at LBC to tweet. But let's return to the stories that are going to be making the news over the next week. Here's story number 3, something that is happening on Monday.
When people say, Mr. Gates, you should feel guilty because you have so much money, well, it's not that I have money, it's my consumption I should, if I'm supposed to feel guilty, it's my consumption. And the idea that consumption should be progressively taxed, I think that makes a lot of sense. Inequality of consumption is more an injustice than a number in a book is.
Billionaire Microsoft founder Bill Gates there on why he shouldn't feel guilty about his income, but rather his consumption, because he believes that's where the real injustice is between the rich and the poor. We're talking about this because on Monday new figures are going to be released which show that by next year, 2016, the 80 richest people on the planet, including Bill Gates, of course, will have the same wealth as the poorest 50%. That's 3.5 billion people will have the same wealth as the 80 richest people. The combined wealth of the richest 1% will overtake that of the other 99% of people as well. It's a report that's being published by Oxfam ahead of the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Switzerland starting on Wednesday. And Oxfam is going to make a number of recommendations, including clamping down on tax avoidance. How do you feel, Atul, about Oxfam actually getting involved in what you might call a political discussion? Obviously, they're there to say, look, there are a lot of poor people in the world and we need to help them, we need to stop inequality. But should they be suggesting political solutions to that, do you think?
I think it's impossible to get involved in a discussion about inequality without getting into political discussions. Politics isn't something that happens in a vacuum. Think back 40 years to the sports boycott of apartheid. Lots of people said, shouldn't mix sport and politics, but actually every aspect of our lives has an element of politics about it. When those sportsmen stepped on a field and black players couldn't play with white players, that's a political decision. When we look at the way our international financial system is governed, when we look at the governance over trade, that's a political decision. Politics is intrinsic, and good on Oxfam for getting involved.
And Elizabeth Jones, what about you? Do you think this is the place of a charity to be looking at this kind of data and analysing what should or shouldn't be done to solve the inequality problem, or do you think that is something politicians should do?
No, of course not. Of course they should investigate the data. Of course, we're in a free society. Why shouldn't they? In fact, I shall very much look forward to reading their recommendations.
How do you feel about inequality in Britain? Because it's something that I understand UKIP have policies on, but it's not something you regularly get airtime to talk about. The conversation normally is more about immigration in Europe, and obviously I imagine your policy about inequality ties into those things.
Well, of course it does, because we think that our membership to the EU is a very significant drain on our income, which filters down to inequality. Also, we want to bring back grammar schools to ensure that there's a grammar school in every town so that poor children can have the opportunity to have private school quality education.
And where do you think Labour stand on that at all? Because the grammar schools thing is kind of awkward for them, isn't it? Because you understand why they can say, oh, grammars were bad, they were a division, but all the statistics say they were good for getting poorer people into universities and onto better professions.
That's not what the statistics say, though. There was a report. There was a report released the week before last, which said that grammar schools did very, very little to tackle inequality. Now, I appreciate where there are grammar schools, people like them, and they can stay. But you can't concentrate on the 5%. You've got to look, if you're talking about education, on lifting up the standards of the 95%. And all of the evidence says, and indeed the evidence under this Conservative government says, that grammar schools don't do that. But when it comes to tackling inequality, Liz, a question just on UKIP's policies, though. UKIP would abolish inheritance tax.
Yes.
The vast majority of that benefit would be enjoyed by the 1%. Does that promote equality?
Well, why would it be 1%? That means that we're going to abolish... The current limit is if your estate is more than £325,000, you pay inheritance tax at 40%. I think that actually mops up considerably more than 1%.
But the people...
Statistically, if you did a vox pop, if you went out now to Leicester Square and did a vox pop, I think you find out most people are likely to... If both the parents die, are going to be inheriting quite a bit more than that and would be hit by inheritance tax, which of course has been taxed and taxed again. What we want to do, we want to leave the EU, that would save us £55 million a day. We want to scrap the HS2 project, that would save us about 10 or 80 million? I forget now off the top of my head. And also we want to scrap foreign aid, which comes back very appropriately to the Oxfam debate. We want to get rid of the 10 billion aid, but keep the 1 billion for humanitarian
aid.
But
let's park foreign aid for a minute, because
I'm
sure we can talk about that in a sec. But Atul's point is, even if it's not the top 5%, even if it's the top 50%, clearly inheritance tax is going to benefit people whose parents are wealthy enough to leave them money in the first place.
It was
so how does that help inequality? I mean, that is a legitimate question, isn't it?
Well, we believe that there shouldn't be double taxation.
Even though that tax could be used to help inequality, that's the thing, isn't it? Tax goes to help poor people.
Well, there has to be fairness as well, and there has to be. I don't think that the people should be penalised.
In terms of tackling inequality, you said tackling inequality was
one
of your objectives.
But another way we want to
if you are left £2 million by your parents, then as opposed to £300,000, you will get more benefit from the richer your parents are. And there is, I think, there are legitimate intellectual arguments for abolishing inheritance tax. There's a very sort of libertarian free market argument for that. But one thing it will not do is tackle inequality.
It may, well, I don't know if it will or will not. It will mean that there will be more money in people's pockets to spend, to encourage business, to encourage people's employment. Another thing...
But it builds generation on generation.
Another attack we would make is that during the 1920s, after the First World War, there was something called the Geddes Axe. This meant that civil servants, high-ranking civil servants, had to experience a considerable drop in their salaries, and that included army officers. This has certainly not happened with this dip in our economy. In fact, while I'm in Dartford, there are at least 4 people in the council earning well over £100,000. It's not a complex job. It doesn't involve your own personal investment of your own capital. We would have a rollout whereby no one in this country, no university head, no university chancellor, no head of any council should be earning certainly more than David Cameron, and I would cap it at £60,000 myself.
But what's that got to do with inheritance tax?
It hasn't got anything to do with inheritance tax. It's got to do with inequality and cutbacks, so we can pour more into the system. One particular
cause... That's still taking people who are very well paid and making them slightly less well paid, isn't it?
Well, it's releasing more money into the system.
Yeah, well, the foreign aid thing is interesting, isn't it? Because obviously that would release more money into the British system.
Release a lot more.
But then, as you say, looking at the Oxfam data, that's not going to help the poor people around the world, which is the purpose of it.
Well, that you may be wrong there. If we follow the teachings of 3 leading African economists, we have Andrew Mwenda of Uganda, we have George Atiye and Damiso Damoyo, Shinkish of Zambia. All 3 of them have actually said that our payment of aid to Africa has made Africa consistently poorer and poorer and poorer, and does not assist growth in Africa, and in fact is holding Africa back, because there is no relationship between the electorate in Africa and the leaders. The leaders do not have to take into account the electorate's needs and wishes because they know they're going to be getting regular handouts via the bilateral aid system. So they don't need to engage.
The budget of foreign aid that we have, because
Yes.
I understand you might say we don't agree with every project that it spends on at the moment.
No.
But presumably things like Ebola is agreeable.
Well, but if you sorry, I don't mean to suggest you want, but if you listened earlier on, there are 4 types of aid. You've got bilateral, whereby aid is paid direct to the country. This is obviously, you can appreciate, quite, I would say, risky. Then you've got multilateral aid to go to a variety of organisations. You've got military aid. Does anyone really believe in military aid anymore after we've seen what's happened in Iraq and Syria? And then you've got humanitarian aid. We would set aside $1 billion for humanitarian for that very purpose. Of course, it is right and proper that Ebola should be. We certainly don't want Ebola spreading into Europe.
And Atul, would you say the foreign aid commitment as it is at the moment to spend a portion of our GDP, a small portion, 0.7% I think it is, isn't it? Would you continue to maintain that? In your view, that's the best way to help people?
I think it's a legitimate question for debate. What we're seeing, I mean, I was at a conference earlier on today where local councillors were speaking, and they were saying the fat's been cut from local authority spending, the muscle's been cut, and now it's cutting into the bone. And in terms of prioritisation, I think there's a legitimate debate as to whether the foreign aid budget should be ring-fenced in the way it is, because the issue with ring-fences, and this applies also if one ring-fences health, is that other areas suffer disproportionately, and that's why on the spending plans of the current government and on the spending plans broadly that Labour has signed up to, we're looking at kind of really very, very drastic cuts to the areas like policing and all of our and local social services, social care, and that's one of the reasons we have this crisis in A&E at the moment, because social care has had to take so many cuts. So there is a legitimate debate about what should be prioritised for spending.
Okay, well, a moment of agreement, as you both suggest. There is a legitimate debate, just different conclusions. So let's leave that there for a second. This is LBC. Olly Mann here, sitting in for Ian Collins until 10 p.m. We're doing the news panel with Atul Hatwal from Labour Uncut and Elizabeth Jones from UKIP. The time now, 9:46.
Olly Mann on LBC.
Good evening, this is LBC with me, Olly Mann. We're doing the news panel before Nick Abbott comes along in 10 minutes' time to take you through to 1am. I'm joined in this hour by the Director of the Migration Matters Trust and Editor of Labour Uncut, Atul Hatwal, and the prospective parliamentary candidate for UKIP in Dartford and Kent, Elizabeth Jones. Tom has tweeted, UKIP spokesperson is losing the argument, or is it only my voice that rises when I'm being embarrassed? I think you don't have to respond to that.
Okay, I won't.
I don't think there's, I think that's just cruel.
That's all right.
Peter in Dartford says, you talk so much sense, Elizabeth. You are a breath of fresh air in Dartford.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Peter.
So there you go, dividing the audience. Although this is an interesting text. I was seriously thinking of voting UKIP at the general election, but after Mr Farage said he'd repeal the current fox hunting ban, I definitely won't be voting for him.
Oh, well, that's a twist. That's an interesting twist.
And is that what you're going to say about fox hunting? Where do you stand on it?
Well, I live in London, and, Dartford's quite rural. It's quite an interesting mix of... The UKIP policy is basically that every county should have a referendum and make its own decision, because we are townies, basically, and we don't understand what impact perhaps foxes have on farmers' livestock. I know in Wales there's been quite a problem with the increasing growth with foxes and sheep. Now, that's a problem we don't understand. That's a problem that's very close to the heart of the Welsh farmers. So we would say each area can make its own decision about that.
Do you think, Atul, this is an issue for Labour? Because the Tories want to repeal the current fox hunting ban as well, don't they? But Labour are quite proud of having banned it. But there is, I've hosted phone-ins here on LBC inevitably about fox hunting. There is actually quite an equal split in the audience. A lot of people say it was a rushed move, and it doesn't understand the country, and you need to control the fox population.
I think in terms of the polling I've seen, there is an overwhelming majority in favour of the ban, and I think it's as we were talking about earlier, it's a political choice, and parties need to sort of nail their sort of colours to the mast and take a position. But what I do think is absolutely unconscionable and disgraceful is that is on the statute books as a law. And this coalition, the Conservative government, the Conservative aspect of the government, has specifically allowed that to lapse. And I think as a precedent, to just say, to give a sort of guidelines to our police that just ignore that bit of the law. I know it's a law, I know it's on the statute books, but just you can ignore that. That is appalling. If they want to repeal it, they've had 5 years to repeal it. Put it to the vote in the House.
Well, you know, the Lib Dems don't want them to repeal it. That's what happened there.
That's the tricky thing with democracy. You know, we all vote for our MPs, and the House of Commons reflects how we vote. And you know, just because it may not accord with your view, you cannot just say ignore that law, nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
Speaking of how we vote, this party are doing rather well at the moment. Here's story number 4.
If we're going to see the views of young people represented in these debates, represented in the coverage, there was a survey just before Christmas that showed that 24% of students, the second largest group of students, want to back the Green Party. YouGov was showing the under 25s 22% back us. If we're excluded from the debates, from the coverage, then really what we're seeing is young people who we very much need for the future of politics to be involved in politics, to hear their views heard, are missing out.
Now, I know what you're thinking. That's last week's news, isn't it? The Green Party and whether or not they should be included in any televised leaders' debates. That was Natalie Bennett, of course, talking about that last week. But we're talking about it this week because on Monday, they weren't going to let it lie, were they? On Monday, they're launching their What Are You Afraid Of, Boys campaign poster as a challenge to the broadcasters over the proposed debates. Elizabeth, do you think the Green Party deserve to be there alongside UKIP, who have only been invited now to be part of the debates after you have kind of proven credibility and legitimacy with the British public? You've won by-elections, you have seats in Parliament. The Green Party have, but, you know, they didn't win the European elections. How do you measure it up? You know, do you include Northern Ireland and Scotland? Should they be there or not?
The Electoral Commission has said that it considers that UKIP is a major party now. The Greens are a minor party, and they will therefore necessarily receive less media exposure. Now, I'm all for democracy. I'm all for the exchange of ideas. I don't really have an objection to them attending any debate. I would very much like to hear from them. You know, the people who brought us meat-free Mondays, 20 mile per hour speed limits, gender-neutral toilets, and questionnaires with Mr., Mrs., Ms and Mix, in case you want to have a range of genders, and who brought us Brighton Council, which in fact ranks 302 out of 326 on the council recycling record. I'd very much like to hear from them. Furthermore, if we're going to get into a more sinister side of things, I should very, very much like to hear about their connection with their German paedophile past.
Well, let's leave that one hanging since they're not here to defend themselves at the moment. But when it comes to green policies, where's UKIP on that?
Well, we want to repeal the Climate Change Act 2008. Many of their policies we do agree with. We both want to have a referendum, which again is assisting democracy.
No, but where do you stand on green policies?
On green policies...
Well, you said you'd repeal the Climate Change Act.
We'd repeal the Climate Change Act.
Would you do anything to benefit the environment?
Well, we want to have brownfield planning. We would remove stamp duty for any development on brownfield. We accept that new homes have to be built. We would want to ensure that empty houses are perhaps refurbished to prevent any further land being used up. With the green policies, not really. No, we don't support wind farms. We don't support subsidised energy. We want to have an investigation as to what's happening with our power. I understand by about 30% of our generative power will have gone. We're losing coal. Well, our coal mines have gone. About 12 out of 17 of nuclear power stations are going to be out of service. So we do need to investigate power. Our concentration, of course, would be a return to full nuclear power, perhaps coal mines and shale. So we do not follow the green agenda.
OK.
But in some areas we do, of course, agree.
Atul, do you think the Green Party should be there?
Yes, certainly. I mean, to get this into some context, what's proposed are 3 debates. One debate would be just Cameron and Miliband. The second debate would be Cameron, Miliband and Clegg, and the third debate is the one that's at question here as to whether the Greens are in, because that's the one with Cameron, Miliband, Clegg and Nigel Farage. And I'd say, for that third one, bring the Greens in, bring the SNP in, bring Plaid Cymru in, and let's have all of them, because actually that will give the full spread, so everyone in the country has a stake in that discussion.
The thing is, was the mistake actually Elizabeth Jones, inviting the Lib Dems into the debates in the first place last time, because really what the public want to see, I think, I know that we all enjoy the circus of Nigel Farage and we enjoy Natalie Bennett and the idea of these clashes ideologically. Really what the public want is the two men who are likely to be Prime Minister discussing what they would do. That is the purpose of a leadership debate. We don't have a presidential system, but as far as it goes, that's what we'd like to see, isn't it?
I don't think so. I think the public are very well informed, and I think they want to see the range of political opportunities before them, like a smorgasbord of policy. Of course,
but why
I think
none of those people
everyone.
are going to be Prime Minister?
It doesn't matter. It's all about picking and choosing policies. It may well be during the course of debate that whoever does become leader may well absorb the policies of the less popular parties.
And also, I mean, the experience of the last 5 years is we've had a coalition government. So actually, the public, deserve to hear from the various parties. And it's actually a bit unfair. I mean, I'm a Labour person, but it's a bit unfair to exclude the Liberals. They've got 57 seats. That's a sizable chunk of the House of Commons, and they are a sizable part of this government. As a matter of basic democracy, the public deserve to hear what these people have to say.
Yes, but the difficulty with coalition, which is what it's likely to be,
yes,
is that the policies they're spelling out, apart from Ed Miliband and David Cameron, the policies that everyone else is spelling out are going to be compromised by the nature of being in coalition, and they can't be honest about that at this stage.
Well, it's not that they can't be honest, they just don't know. No one has the gift of prescience, they just don't know. Now, I think it's right and fair there should be a broad range. The public are fully entitled to hear all the policies of the respective parties being debated. I frankly would also like to hear from the Justice for Men and Boys, the new political party on the scene. I'd very much like to hear their policies.
Well, there we go. Let's.
I've never heard of Justice for Men and Boys.
Oh, I think you'll be hearing a lot from them soon.
There's the Whig Party, I know, have reformed recently as well. Maybe we could hear from them too. Elizabeth Jones, Atul Hatwal, thank you very much for joining me. You're both on Twitter?
Yes.
Where can people find you, Atul?
So at Atul H or at Labour Uncut.
There we go. And Elizabeth?
At Jones Elizab.
There we go. That is it from them. That is it from me, at Olly Mann. Thank you for all of your contributions in the last... what's it been, 3.5 hours. I'm back on Monday from 1am in my usual Through the Night slot, and I'll also be here next weekend as well. No, I won't. That's last week's script. I won't be here next week. Ian will be here next week, and I'm sure you'll enjoy his company. Don't forget, you can listen to LBC whenever and wherever you like. You can download the LBC app, or there's the TuneIn Radio app as well. And if you missed any of my show today, something you can do is go to our podcast service. Coming up at 1am, Darren Adam is in for Christo, but now it's Nick Abbott.